All right, let's take a look at this week's internet weather. These are the top 10 most probed ports for the last week. You can see that there are a couple of movers and shakers in the list. We'll get to them in just a second, but we'll run through the ports one by one. So in first place, king for forever apparently is 23 TCP or Telnet, followed by ICMP, which is ping. Um, 81 TCP has moved up 3 spots. That one's kind of interesting. Generally, it's an alternate web port. Take a closer look at that. In fourth place, we have 22 TCP or SSH, followed by 443 TCP or TLS. 80 TCP is right below that. That is plain old web traffic or HTTP. 6379 TCP is Redis, which is an in-memory data store. Then in eighth and ninth, in eighth and ninth spots, sorry, in the eighth and ninth places, we have 2375 and 2376 TCP. These are both related to Docker. And in 10th place, we have 8080 TCP, which is an alternate web port, but also sometimes a web proxy port. So here we have the top 10 most sources probing for the past week. This is individual sources and not a measure of volume. You can see that there have been only a few minor moves this week. We'll run through these ports one by one. So 445 TCP is SMB, most famously these days associated with the WannaCry worm and the Eternal Blue exploits, followed by 22 TCP, which is again SSH. 8728 TCP and 8291 TCP are both related to MikroTik routers. 23 TCP is Telnet, that's down 2. In sixth place, we have 80 TCP, plain old HTTP. Seventh place, we've got ICMP. In eighth place, we have 5555 TCP, which is Android Remote Debug Bridge, which is always an interesting one to me. These are people who have exposed the remote debugging port on an Android device, which would allow an attacker to go in and potentially get root access. So 8080 TCP is an alternate web port again, and we round out with 1433 TCP, which is Microsoft SQL Server. Taking a closer look at the movers and shakers for this week, we have port 81 TCP, which is an alternate HTTP port. We're taking a look at 90 days here. You can see a big spike on the far right side of that graph. There are regular periodic spikes throughout this graph, as you can see, but most of them come up a little bit out of nowhere. This, as you can see, is there's actually a rising peak in the last week at the base of that spike. So we have major clusters of sources in the US and Hungary, and then major individual sources in the US, Netherlands, and Denmark. This port is also, interestingly, just found this out, listed some places as Tor Park onion routing. I'm not necessarily confident that that's what's going on here. I think it's much more likely that you've got some sort of web service or perhaps an IoT device that happens to use port 81, and that's being targeted. Any thoughts, guys?
No, I'd be interested in seeing a longer view on this. Is this something that normally we see some spikes in the last 90 days that weren't quite this high, but is this something that normally goes spikes every week or so about that height, and this week just went a little higher, or?
That's a great question. Um, yeah, I mean, we do have 90 days here. That's a quarter of a year. I guess we can go find out. But I tend to think that that spike is some sort of scheduled scan, probably a research organization or something like that. That's usually my take on something like that. What do you think?
Well, that's what it looks like to me, but not knowing exactly what those sources are that are making up that spike. It's just something that I'm curious about. The last few times I've been on the show, it's gotten my attention that occasionally we're seeing changes in patterns, and sometimes it just really is a long-term pattern that we're seeing again and again. And just curious.
Okay. All right. Next up, we have port 443 TCP, which is HTTPS. 30 days here, you can see that the spikes that are relevant to us are somewhere around here, around between the 3rd and the 5th. This is a huge cluster there. Well, there's a huge, and I'm talking around 400 cluster of sources in a US cloud provider here, which is pretty significant. It's not the sum total of all of the sources, but it is the largest one when you sort by the AS number. There's also a large contributor, maybe in the tens of devices. That's a US research org, folks that scan the internet on the regular and provide that data out. We also have some top sources in the US and also in the EU. 443 is one of those ports that's been around forever. We'll probably still continue to see a large amount of scanning there. And it could be anything. That's the thing about 443 is that there's just so many different types of services. I mean, yes, they are all HTTPS services, but different types of web servers, different kinds of devices, completely different operating systems. So it's hard to pin down exactly what people are looking at here. So who knows? It could be anything. What do you guys think?
This is exactly the kind of port, though, where you really do need a honeypot
Yep.
that's got a certificate on it, so you can see what requests it is that they're making on here, because 443 is just so ubiquitous that, as you said, it could be anything.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see, like you said, a certificate in a honeypot with maybe even a lower, like, SSL 2, all the way up, just to see what they're trying to probe at, depending upon what level of encryption they detect.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I think if you're scanning for vulnerabilities, you're not super concerned as to how secure or vulnerable your target is. You've probably got something already in mind. But it could be something different. It could be like an internet census group of some kind, just trying to gather information about the types of web services that are actually out there on the internet. It's without being the endpoint that receives the request, you have no way of knowing if it's a legitimate request or a malicious one. It's like you said, hard to know.
Yeah, but I'm going to put a honeypot out there with a Let's Encrypt certificate on it, just to collect, these random scans. Because with Let's Encrypt, you just automate it. You got a bash script that runs out of cron and updates the certificates, and so that's my next personal research project. I'll get on that this weekend.
Okay. Sounds fun. And that's the internet weather, folks.